By the time the Aeneid begins, the worst has already happened. After 10 years of grueling siege, the Trojan prince Aeneas awakes to find that the Greeks have infiltrated the city. Troy is lost. All he wants to do is make one last stand, but the gods have other plans for him. He has to trek across the Mediterranean to found a new Troy, Rome. It's a miserable task for a grieving man, made worse by the fact that the queen of the gods, Juno, hates the idea of a new Troy and wants to sabotage Aeneas. The Aeneid begins with her causing a shipwreck, so Aeneas washes up on the shores of modern Tunisia, bone-weary and wishing he'd died back home. But he's got people to provide for, so he anxiously makes his way to the closest town, the newly founded city of Carthage. As he walks through the city with his friend Achates, Aeneas is struck by Carthage's booming construction and envious of it, especially since the Carthaginians, like the Trojans, are refugees. Then he comes across a temple to Juno. On the side of it is an image that depicts the war between Greece and Troy. Aeneas sees 10 years worth of death and destruction, his own dead friends and family, and immediately starts weeping. But at the same time, this work allays some of his fears. He excitedly tells Achates that this frieze makes it very clear that every region on Earth must know and care about what happened in Troy, that even in Carthage there's respect for honorable deeds, and at line 462 he says, sunt lacrimae. Now, if you're translating this passage, let me tell you, these words make you feel pretty good. You've got sunt, form of the verb to be, easy, there are. You've got lacrimae, means tears, even easier. There are tears, and life is good. You're riding high. You are communing with the ghost of Virgil himself. And then, the ghost of Virgil hits you with rerum, and that's when the real lacrimae show up. Sunt lacrimae rerum are widely acknowledged as some of the most famous words from the Aeneid, a poem widely acknowledged as one of the most famous from antiquity. The phrase has been called the second name of the poem, its thesis, line 462, the finest line in all of Latin verse, praised for its wondrous beauty and pathetic dignity, for being daring, tentative, and mysterious, an example of Virgilian dexterity and subtlety. It's also notoriously difficult to translate, to the point that some translators of the Aeneid, as I'll discuss later in this video, just point-blank refuse to include it. And there's even an entire article about how translating it is a thankless task. Part of the problem is that no one can agree what it means. People have been arguing about this line for literally centuries, to the point that even 100 years ago, a scholar could ask, has any line been so often quoted and so completely misunderstood? These days, lacrimae rerum has its own Wikipedia page, and anybody who still wants to weigh in on what it means feels like they might have to explain themselves. Much has been written about this passage, David Wharton noted dryly back in 2008. Some may think too much. Not me, though. I love what's been written, not least because it's led to some of the best academic burns I've ever read, so please stay tuned for that. What makes this line so untranslatable? And why do people care so much about it? Let's go back to communing with the ghost of Virgil. We'd gotten to that word rerum, and the problem is that the most basic translation of that word is of things, which gives us there are tears of things, which just doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it's only the first half of the line, so maybe the ghost of Virgil will clarify in the second half. But the second half is et mentem mortalia tangunt. Et means and, mentem means mind. Mortalia is transient things, things related to or done by mortals as opposed to gods. And then tangunt is the verb to touch. So if you put those all together, you get there are tears of things and mortal things touch the mind, which just doesn't sound like one of the most famous lines from one of the most famous poems in all of history. If I were Achates and Aeneas turned to me and said, there are tears of things, and mortal things touch the mind, I would not let go of fear, which is the next thing Aeneas says. I would wonder if he'd been hit on the head with a Carthaginian construction beam. This translation is what I call translationese, where it gives us some sense of the Latin, but very little sense of the sense. There's a couple problems here, and the first has to do with that phrase, of things, which can actually be broken down into two issues, one to do with of, and one to do with things. So I'm going to go through the philology and the grammar and the semantics related to of and things, and if that doesn't sound thrilling to you, then the word rerum is a form of the word race. It's hard to overstate how broad a term race is. The Oxford Latin Dictionary lists 19 different ways to interpret it. Its most concrete meaning is property or wealth in the sense of possessions or private property or supplies. But it can also be used in a more generic sense to mean simply a thing, or, and here's where it starts to get tricky, the actual thing as opposed to the words that signify it, or the real thing, which is actually how we get that word real. It comes from the word race. From there, we move on to race as a deed or an act, action as a thing. So when the Emperor Augustus posted a list of his accomplishments to be read throughout the empire, he called them the race. It can also mean the practice of doing something, or an affair, or matter, or one's purpose, or intent, or a situation, or circumstance, or even a concern or interest, which leads to phrases like res publica, the state as the community's race. English has no equivalent. It's got words with a similar breadth of application, like matter or affair, but they don't have the same range of meanings. Race is also a vague word, like thing, and that's how you wind up altogether with of things. So that covers the things in of things, but we still have to cover the of. Okay, I'm gonna have to talk about some of the technical aspects of Latin for a second, but it's to set up for the scholarly hellfire that's coming, so just let me sketch it out. The of comes from what's called the case of the word, and rerum is in a case called the genitive case. I won't go into what cases are, but the closest equivalent for the genitive in English would be phrases with the word of. And of can mean a lot of things, including the buildings of Carthage, in the sense that Carthage has the buildings, so Carthage's buildings. So this could be the things tiers, or tiers belong to things. You also have phrases like fear of attack, where attack is the object of the action implied in fear. So essentially, we fear attack. We have a fear of attack. So if we turn that into our phrase, we've got the tiers for things, where there's a kind of crying action implied in tiers. And we've also got something like the victory of the Greeks, where the Greeks are the subject of the action implied in victory. The Greeks were victorious, which would give us the things are crying. Most people default to the second one, saying it's tiers for things. But my point here is that the genitive covers a wide range of meanings, so there is a lot of room for interpretation, at least grammatically. Rerum is definitely the biggest stumbling block for this line, but then we get mortalia, and let's say if it doesn't make it harder to translate, it definitely doesn't make it any easier. As an adjective, like I said before, it means stuff related to, done by, having to do with mortals as opposed to gods. And mortalia itself is an adjective being used to define this noun that really has no other definition except for the fact that it has to do with things that are mortalis, mortal. And the closest way to translate that in English is mortal things. And then just as a final cherry of complication on this big complicated cake, Latin uses the phrase touch the mind, where English might say something like touch the heart. Ancient Greek, by the way, says touch the liver. That's not relevant, I just think it's cool. Altogether, you've got a line that's vague and difficult in a way that's specific to Latin, the way that Latin's vocabulary, its grammar, the way it approaches the abstract. That's part of what makes it so difficult to translate, but we're still getting to the second reason why some translators just refuse to translate this phrase. And that reason starts with early translators of the Aeneid, so going back to the 16th and 17th century. And those translators, while they were approaching this line, had to answer one very important question, which was, what do I think of England? Let me explain. Early translations of the Aeneid into English, so starting in the 16th century, were all kind of caught up in a period of English history where its government, its religion, and ultimately its identity were all being pretty hotly contested. The Aeneid was a great way to comment on that. It was about the founding of an empire, about what it means to be a patriot, and it was also about the founding of Rome's empire. Virgil wrote under Augustus, who had won a civil war that turned the Republic into an empire and made Augustus the first emperor, and he claimed that he was essentially refounding Rome. So the Aeneid praises both Aeneas and Augustus, which made it a really attractive poem for anyone who wanted to show their support for a particular monarch. It was also considered an epic poem par excellence. So translating it was not just about creating another English epic, but about establishing English as the language for epic, and depending on the translator, even arguing what kind of English should be the English for epic. You can start to see the impact all of that had on line 462 in Richard Stanihurst's version from 1583. Stanihurst was, I guess I'd call him a poet's poet. He was pretty radical, he was ambitious, he was experimental. He didn't just want to translate Latin into English, he wanted to make English into a kind of Latin. So he translated in a way that preserved some of Latin syntax and even Latin meter, which works very differently from English meter. He also was Anglo-Irish, and his translation reflected an ongoing argument with the English about what kind of English should be the English for epic. The result is easily the most hated Aeneid ever made. Also, Stanihurst went on to be an alchemist. I wouldn't say that's related, except as Maurice Kajowski has pointed out, both his Aeneid and alchemy are about an impossible transformation. If alchemy is about turning lead into gold, Stanihurst wanted to create a golden Aeneid. People have bashed Stanihurst's work pretty much since it came out. It was called a foul, lumbering, boisterous, wallowing measure soon after it was published, and since then it has been called a monstrosity that's barely English, proof that Stanihurst is the common sewer of the English language, and a work of perversely vigorous liberty. He even recently showed up in the Latin subreddit in a post entitled, "Who wants to see the worst translation of the Aeneid of all time?" Anyway, here's his take on Sunt Lacrimae Rerum. "Some tears this monument, and some compassion asketh." Do you think this is the worst version of all time? I haven't actually shown you any other versions, but keep it in mind about whether you think it's the worst version of all time. Because I have to admit that I don't. I think what really stands out to me is that arresting, humble sum. John Wright argues that this sum which turns tears into some tears and compassion into some compassion makes some come to stand for transience, mortality, the imperfection of human life, and the impossibility of human dreams. The essence, he argues, of Sunt Lacrimae Rerum. It's also an earthy Germanic word, unlike the fancy Latinate monument and compassion. And I think Stanihurst really stresses with it that it's the English words, the Germanic words, that are doing the heavy lifting, not the Latin ones. The other thing that stands out is that this is not a literal translation. After all that explanation about race and the genitive, there's just no sense of that in this translation. There's no sense that this is a difficult line to translate or any sort of ambiguity. It's just not there. He's going for what's called the paraphrase, the gist of it, rather than the metaphrase, the literal translation. That was not uncommon for this period, and I think the clearest example comes from what has been called the best English Aeneid of all time. That was the version by John Dryden in 1697. His take on the line is even more of a paraphrase than Stanihurst's, and I'll give you the line before as well, so you get a sense of his rhyming couplets. So Aeneas turns to Achates and says, "Even here the mute walls relate the warrior's fame, and Trojan griefs, the Tyrians, that is the Carthaginians, pity claim." Dryden also explained why he translated this way. In the preface to his translation, he says that his goal was to preserve what he called the beauty of Virgil's words, and that meant accepting that many of them cannot be translated literally. Most of Virgil's words are of necessity to be lost, because they will not shine in any way but their own. I have endeavored to make Virgil speak such English as he would himself have spoken if he had been born in England and in this present age. To Dryden, rerum is a word that cannot shine in any way but its own, and so he really stresses on what he thinks Virgil is trying to say. And that sense is also really clear and very specific. This is not a general comment on people feeling sad for things. This is the Carthaginians specifically feeling bad for the Trojan circumstances specifically. And all of that means that they'll be safe. Aeneas goes on to tell Achates that he doesn't have to be afraid anymore because this renown will offer them some safety. The immediate message is about safety, but there's also a subtext, I think, that this isn't about human suffering in general, but the suffering of a specific nation. Troy, but I think also ultimately England. Dryden wasn't the only one to translate this way. Before him, it shows up in George Sandys' translation in 1632. "Here virtue hath her meed, and our misfortunes human pity breed." And John Ogilby's from 1649, "Reward here virtue finds, Troy tears, and human sufferings pitying minds." And even decades later in Christopher Pritt's version from 1740, "For Troy the generous tears of Carthage flow, and Tyrian breasts are touched with human woe." In all of these, the line is what Nicholas Horsfall has called a non-problem, one that he says in one of the grouchiest footnotes I've ever read. Only rank bad Latin could turn into something else. Now, you know I am dying to talk about this rank bad Latin, but to do that, first we have to just so quickly go through the next 2 centuries of Vergilian translation. Just like a quick jaunt, a little stroll, a hop, skip, and a Dryden's Aeneid was an instant classic, but that also made it a watershed moment. Rather than compete with him, many translators went in the opposite direction. So even almost 200 years later, you had someone like Sir Charles Bowen criticize Dryden in the preface to his own translation. Dryden scarcely gives us more than a paraphrase. He has taken Virgil into his powerful grasp, crushed him into atoms, and reproduced the fragments in a form which, though not devoid of genius, is no longer Virgil's. All translators of the Aeneid want to be faithful to it in some way, but in this period that increasingly meant not making the poem your own, the way that Dryden had done. But even more importantly, this period had a slow shift of the Aeneid away from the idea of the poem as a poem of empire. After the Glorious Revolution, there was an impulse to really rescue the Aeneid from themes of monarchy and empire and even politics altogether. So by the end of the 19th century, Virgil is now a poet of feelings, of pathos, of lacrimae rerum as a general lament for the world, the kind of poet that Tennyson called majestic in thy sadness. We can already start to see that show up, I think, by Alexander Strahan's translation of line 462 in 1739. In scenes like these, we trace humanity, and man with man, related by the kindred sense of woe. The focus is broad now. The context is still the same. It's still about the Trojans in Carthage, but we don't really get a sense of that from just this line. This is about humanity, capital H. In 1794, we get James Beresford's, "Even in these regions, tears are found to flow, and mortal miseries touch the feeling breast." But in 1871, by Davidson offers, "Here are tears for misfortunes, and the breasts are touched with human woes." In 1886, John Connington says, "In here the tear of pity springs, and hearts are touched by human things." And in 1887, after taking that swing at Dryden, Bowen offers, "Tears are to human sorrows given, hearts feel for mankind." Race is now human sorrows, and lacrimae rerum is what Philip Hardie has called the generalized melancholy at the human lot. This take, though, is best summed up by one of the most controversial grammatical interpretations in the history of grammatical interpretations of the Aeneid, which I know is a very bold claim, but let me explain. In 1873, James Henry published his commentary of the Aeneid. And I just have to take a second to talk about how this commentary comes about. Henry was apparently obsessed with the Aeneid almost from birth. One of the things he does as a kid is use some birthday money at age 11 to buy a copy of the Aeneid. He remained obsessed with it. He went on to get a classics degree, but he also got one in medicine and became a doctor. Apparently a very successful and progressive one. But then, in 1845, he inherits quit your job money. So he instantly quits his job and spends the next 30 years traveling around Europe with his daughter, who helped him look at over 100 manuscripts in order to write a 3,000-page commentary on the Aeneid. To line 462, Henry argued that lacrimae rerum was not tears for things, either tears for misfortunes or human sorrows or anything. He gives a couple of reasons that I won't go into here, but the main one is that he's found a parallel for lacrimae rerum in the poetry of the 6th century bishop named Venantius Fortunatus. And there, in Fortunatus's work, it means the tears of the world, so the tears belong to the world. And so that means, he says, that Virgil's lacrimae rerum must be a general reflection concerning human sympathy, i.e. that tears are part of the constitution of nature, and to be met with wherever there are men. It is as if Aeneas had said, "Even here the misfortunes of the brave meet with sympathy, for sympathy is a part of human nature." This romantic interpretation of Virgil was very attractive. In both the 19th century and afterwards, it has really remained popular with a lot of people. But not everyone. This read is what made H. Williamson cry that the line has been completely misunderstood. It's what Horsfall called rank bad Latin. This interpretation made some people really, really mad. George Seymour Conway, 1935, in just a short commentary on Book 1 of the Aeneid, stops to say, "Henry, apparently misled by a careless line of Fortunatus, first hit on the strange notion that rerum meant tears of the world. The Latinity and prosody of that rather comic bishop of the 6th century AD hardly recommend him as an interpreter of Virgil." He said his notions are strange and his comparanda are comical. Those are fighting words. Even in the 19th century, in 1895, you had someone like Robert Tyrrell praise Henry's read as refined and scholarly, but then go on to ask, may not the words bear a meaning far more definite, weighty, and distinguished? His read, by the way, is that the things themselves are crying. So if you're keeping track, we've got the Carthaginians are crying over the Trojan things, we've got people cry over things in general, we've got that tears belong to the category of things, and now we've got that the things themselves are crying. But all of these criticisms pale in comparison to one of the saltiest articles I have ever read. It's from Douglas J. Stewart in 1971. So he starts by looking at a translation from John Conington from 1900. Here, too, there are tears for misfortune and hearts which are touched by mortality. The problem, Stewart says, is that Conington's words for me are impossible to remember 2 minutes after my eyes have left the page. I am not urging my private feelings on the reader, of course. My point is rather that real statements of any sort on any subject are normally easier to recall than this. And that leads to the question whether Conington's words mean anything at all. Even apart from the Latin lurking behind them, one wonders why anyone would make such a vapid statement as "there are tears for human misfortune." You translate Virgil forgettably. That is such a great insult. But Stewart is very frustrated, and I suspect not just with this one translation from 1900, because the soft romance of 19th century Virgil did crumble under the weight of 2 world wars. The trend became to look at the Aeneid as a poem about war, the one that Aeneas wages and survived, and also the one that Augustus waged on his own people to become emperor. Many interpretations leaned into the idea that Virgil was split between supporting power and, at the very least, grieving its price, as Adam Parry discusses in The Two Voices of Virgil's Aeneid. Parry says that line 462 represents the essential paradox of the Aeneid. The images in Carthage make Aeneas feel Priam's death not less deeply, but more. At the same time, they are a redemption of past suffering. Broadly speaking, there was the sense that the Aeneid was a poem of unresolved tension or ambiguity. Is Virgil supporting Augustus? Is he not? And that was reflected in translation. And then at the same time, the trend in translation was increasingly to have the translator be as unseen as possible, to be invisible, ideally. Sarah Rudin, in the introduction to her translation of the Aeneid, actually compares it to method acting. In writing fiction, you should work to get into your characters' minds. In translating, you should work to get into your authors. And an attempt to keep as close to possible to his style is one way to do this. The result is, again, broadly speaking, translations that tend to stick very closely to the Latin and often sound very similar to Conington's. I won't go into every translation, but just to give you a sense of how translations in the 20th and the 21st century have approached this line, we've got "there are tears for misfortune," "here are tears for distress," "here are tears over fortune," "tears in the nature of things," "here are tears for misfortune," and "there are tears for passing things. They weep here for how the world goes. There are tears. There are tears for suffering. They weep for things. Here are the tears of the ages. Even here, the world is a world of tears. Human events stir tears, and tears of pity. There are the tears of things. These are the tears of things for what they were and what has become of them. And the world weeps. Are these vapid statements? That's up to you. Personally, I do think some of them are, but I really like ones like "the world weeps" for how condensed that is, for how it captures, I think, the all-encompassing nature of Sunt lacrimae rerum in just those 3 words. And as someone who likes thinking about the meaning of rerum, I really liked the things for what they were and what has become of them. And then you have cases like Cecil Day Lewis, where "tears in the nature of things" does sound a little wimpy if you ask me, but if you look at the line before, you can see that he has included this really powerful somehow. Here too, we find virtue somehow rewarded. Tears in the nature of things, hearts touched by human transience. That somehow is just so plaintive to me, and it colors the rest of the line and suggests that maybe we can't just look at this line in isolation. Which is what I've been doing this whole time. With all the baggage this line brings, you might be thinking, well, okay, it's untranslatable, so why translate it? And if you think that, you're not alone. In 2015, David Hadmonic, in his version of the Aeneid, says that with all the good translations already out there, that fact liberates one to do something more creative with the poetry and not worry so much about literal accuracy. In the introduction, Chris Puma goes even further. This translation argues, we do not need to nervously hold on to every word of the original text as if it were a lifeline. There are enough other translations of this poem for the nervous. That did make me laugh. And as someone who's written a whole video about how this line is translated, which really only touches the tip of this iceberg, I think it's probably fair to say that some people get a bit worked up about it. But if Hadbonic says that this line doesn't need to be translated, Len Kresek kind of leads into the idea that it shouldn't be. His version is that here, too, men's griefs touch others with lacrimae rerum. And there's a note explaining that the deep sadness in these words is almost beyond articulation. I get where Kresek is coming from. Not translating, it's an interpretation, it is a form of translation. But also, yeah, come on. If you think this line is about deep sadness, it is kind of your job to articulate it. For me, the clearest argument about why this line needs to be translated comes from, of all things, Britain's inquiry into its role in the Iraq War. In the transcript released in 2016, one of the committee members in the inquiry asks an unnamed MI6 agent what they thought of the report that, in fact, no weapons of mass destruction, the entire pretext for the war, had ever been found in Iraq. What did the MI6 agent think of that report? Sunt lacrimae rerum, really, is the agent's response. Would you like to elaborate? Asks the committee member. And the agent replies, I think that says it all. And I think we'd all agree that no, that does not say it all. Sunt lacrimae rerum cannot come to mean, I don't want to elaborate. If you're going to engage with it, you have to be willing to say what it means. For my money, I don't think it's a comment on human nature in general. I think it's Aeneas interpreting what this image means for him and the other Trojans because they're all lost and afraid. And as far as translation goes, I think Stanihurst set a pretty high bar with some tears this monument and some compassion asketh. I think all translation is a kind of alchemy, but it's still worth doing. And John Connington actually talks about this in the introduction to one of his translations of the Aeneid, and after letting Stuart rip into him before, I think it's only fitting to let him have the last word. And he says, there is something to the mere fact of novelty, something in disturbing the cluster of conventional associations which gathers around an author, and compelling the reader to regard what he has hitherto admired traditionally from a new point of view. I think I've added some novelty with an emoji translation, but now I want to hear your point of view. What do you think Virgil is trying to say? Which translation was your favorite? Do you think any of them were vapid? Let me know in the comments, but please have some compassion.